Tonight, a special edition of the Wheelhouse. It's election night. The polls are closing. Who will be chosen? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. About an hour to go until the polls close here in Connecticut. We're going to walk you through the latest on local races. Hey, we're going to check in on all things presidential and look ahead to the future. You'll hear from some Wheelhouse regulars. Oh, I can't wait for you to see them. Plus, Connecticut Public reporters in the field reporting on the local congressional races. We got all your bases covered. Been a chaotic build-up to tonight. The current president, Joe Biden, dropped out of the race this summer, and former President Donald Trump walked away from two assassination attempts. The roller coaster won't necessarily end tonight. So when will a clear winner be declared? And once a winner is declared, will the American people and the parties accept the results? So many questions swirling around. Luckily, I have a panel of esteemed guests here to help answer them right next to me in Hartford on election night. First, Mercy Quay, founder and CEO of the Narrative Project, also teaching at Quinnipiac University. Happy election night.
Happy election night.
Oh, so good to see you.
Likewise.
Slaying in white. Thank you so much.
Suffragette white. How to do it.
Suffragette white. Mm-hmm. Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Hello, Jonathan.
Evening, Frankie.
You look so excited.
I don't like TV. Sorry. I'd rather be on the radio. I look better on it.
You look beautiful tonight. I love you.
Look up,
and Charles Venator Santiago. Charles, an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and El Instituto at University of Connecticut. Charles, thank you for joining us today.
Hola, Frankie.
Oh, you look happy. And you should be. Joining us a little bit later, we have our colleagues and guests, as we told you, coming up, including maybe a surprise guest. But first, we want to talk about you, and we want you to give us a call. How you feeling tonight? We're here for you. It's why we're live. So share your thoughts with us. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas acerca de la elección, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
That's right. We want bilingual callers. We'd like to take callers in both languages. We can. Mercy, you get the first question. We're going to begin at the national level.
Yep.
What's really at stake tonight?
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah, answer it.
Yeah. So I'll start with women's rights. I'm wearing white for that reason specifically. I think any woman who thinks about issues beyond themselves, beyond their generation, is really concerned about the authoritarian rule that Trump threatens to control women with. The sentence, the phrase, the comment that I will protect your bodies, whether you like it or not, or something to that degree, right? I think that there is a sense that the Republican Party, broadly speaking, flip-flops on this. We want big government. We want government small. We want government out of our bedrooms. But then they legislate in ways that deeply, deeply control women's bodies. And I think that's on the ballot tonight. And what we're seeing from women across the state and across the country is they're fed up.
Preview this a little bit later, but Charles, just high level, people care about reproductive rights in surveys?
All over the place. Not as much as the economy and housing, but it's a top issue for some folks.
Jonathan Wharton, join us for this conversation. I just want to know, polls leading up to the election showing it's going to be a close race. We know that sometimes the polls are wrong. What are you anticipating?
Well, national polls are problematic. And, of course, it's prone to misrepresentation or even underrepresentation of a lot of voters. And we need to remember that, unaffiliated voters are plurality. And so they're representing a good share of it, and it's difficult to nail them down. And so we've seen this in previous races, certainly at the national, but I don't want to exclude also at even the state level, congressional level. I mean, there are congressional races also taking place, and this will be very important on the congressional side of it, of what numbers we're dealing with among these unaffiliated voters.
Congressional race is very important. It was so glad that the team here, including Chloe Wynn, our producer, we got all these interviews with congressional candidates. Some of you guys actually got to join in on some panels with these guests as well so that we could hear from folks. Go back to ctpublic.org there. Nationally, we're talking about the polls, as I mentioned. The last 2 election cycles, Donald Trump has outperformed the polls, and it seems like this time around to win, Kamala Harris is going to have to outperform the polls.
I mean, where do we start with that? I think that she has been the underdog for the last 4 months. She had a big gap to fill. She started the race late, quite literally. When we think about that analogy, the physical imagery of starting the race late, there's something analogous there with where I think Black women are in our country in general, starting the race from, a finish line, a starting point that is way well behind their white and male counterparts, and a race that ends up being, sullied with barriers and obstacles throughout the entire way. And I think those are the characteristics of Kamala's uphill battle.
What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, it's also dynamics of also generational politics. I think we're tending to ignore that and overlook that because obviously she was there to fill in the gap of dealing with Joe Biden, his possibility of running again too. So we can't overlook just, the generational considerations for this. I mean, there was a reason for all this. And I find an interesting twist was Nancy Pelosi who orchestrated that.
Mm-hmm.
Charles, at El Instituto, at the university, are students anxious at this time?
I was really excited to see polls at UConn. I just wasn't as excited to see.
That's right. Give us a little background on that, right? Because now you have the first early in-person polling place on actual campus.
Yeah. When I first arrived to UConn, I was always complaining about that because I arrived in 2007. So the Obama election was a big election. But we couldn't mobilize students because the lines were incredible in stores. And now we have a poll there, and it's hard to mobilize the students to walk right next to the Gamble Pavilion to vote, which is surprising, but it's a work in progress.
Local races, Jonathan, you hinted at them earlier. Is there anything you're watching in particular? Are we going to have another close race in the 5th District where Jahana Hayes is our current Congresswoman?
Well, I guess speaking of Congress, sure. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of attention, national attention related to that, and certainly the tri-state area media has been obsessed about this. And we can't forget that the national political parties have given a lot of money to both races. So there's going to be a lot of attention on this. And again, this will be interesting because we need to keep in mind the last time around we had both candidates running. That was during a midterm race. So we're going to see a larger share of voters coming out for this race because it's a presidential one. So we have to pay attention to that turnout effect for both sides, both parties.
Oh, this is exciting. I'm about to do something that really excites me, and we're going to check in with one of our regulars on Connecticut Public's The Wheelhouse. We're going to hear now from Lisa Hagan, federal policy reporter with both the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public. There she is on screen, up in Connecticut, not in the Capitol Hill tonight. Where are you tonight, Lisa?
Hey, Frankie. I am in downtown Waterbury. We are very close to Congresswoman Jahana Hayes' election night party. It's very quiet right now. Right behind me is where people will start trickling into this ballroom, getting ready to celebrate. But we got some time as polls are almost closed.
You look terrific. It's good to see you on camera here. I just want to know, is anybody there yet?
I think mostly just staffers and some press who are very eager to cover this race.
Sure, including Lisa Hagan, who's been covering it pretty much since it ended the last time. National implications, though, in this race. Can you button that up for us, what we were just talking about?
Yeah, it's definitely possible this can be a puzzle piece in the fight over the House majority. Now, last time, Jahana Hayes did win this race in a very close race, but Republicans still took back the House majority. So it's completely possible this race can go one way or the other and a different party gets it. But I think there's a lot of national attention, a lot of national money that's been put into this race because it could play a role in what will probably be a very, again, potentially narrow majority that one of these parties have. So it's definitely possible this could be, decide which party will get the House majority or just play a role in how big of a majority or how narrow of a majority either Democrats or Republicans get.
2,000 votes separated these two when they met 2 years ago. So I just want to know, those PACs and the money that you said that was coming in nationally, do we have any idea if George Logan was able to close the gap financially? And if not, did any of these ads, such as Jahana Hayes, him saying that she's against police, something like that, did it help his cause in any way?
No, he did not close the fundraising gap, though both candidates did definitely raise a lot more money, both of them, than they did in their 2022 campaign. She still was able to bring in more, but hey, at the same time, they both spent a ton of money on ads this campaign cycle, and they both had help from national outside groups. Now, the one thing I will say, though, is that one of the biggest players in the 2022 race for George Logan was Congressional Leadership Fund. That is a major GOP super PAC. They did not spend any money in this race this time around, and they pulled about $500,000 or so, a little bit more, into trying to boost him and do some ads on his behalf. And so, a little bit less outside money coming in, but I mean, voters, I'm pretty sure voters still got inundated with ads. I was at my hotel lobby this morning and saw a Jahana Hayes ad this morning, so they had plenty of ads trying to reach voters up until the last minute.
Jahana Hayes is partying tonight. Looks like Lisa Hagan's partying tonight. Is George Logan partying tonight?
He is not holding an election watch party.
So are we going to hear from him? I guess that's the question.
They were both in Waterbury.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spoke to his campaign. They plan to put out a statement depending on how the night goes. I mean, I think we're in for a potentially long night, and so we will definitely hear some sort of statement if a definitive call was made in this race. Basically, if it ends up being too close to call, like it was 2 years ago, and we're into the 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. hour, I imagine we will eventually hear from them. But they are watching the election results and returns on their own.
Lisa Hagan, so good to see you tonight. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making this really rich with news tonight, joining us from Waterbury. Lisa Hagan is a federal policy reporter for both Connecticut Public and, of course, the CT Mirror. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thanks, Frankie.
So we got to hear a little bit there on the 5th District. What do you all think about what we just heard? Who wants to start it off? Jonathan, you go ahead.
Well,
you seemed like you had a thought.
I did. It is interesting about the money spent and the PAC money coming through both sides, but clearly Hayes has got that advantage point, and that's been certainly the focus of a lot of Connecticut media. It is interesting that he's not having an election party, because it's no secret beyond this race, previous races when he's run for state senate have always been nail biters. So I don't want to forget that part of it. Even for his re-election campaigns, they've always come in so close, and I've been at some of those election parties in the past with him, and they're always nail biters. They have a lot of lawyers surrounding him. They always have to kind of compete and fight for every vote, and so it might come down to a recount again, I bet. Turnout was tight. Is going to be definitely more this time around. More people are going to turn out to vote than they did in 2022. It is an election year. Just for example, in 2020, the last time that we all voted in a presidential election, you had about 80% turnout, much lower in the midterm. So how does that impact this race?
It's interesting. I think that with such a narrow lead in her last race, Jahana has a uphill battle that I am not certain she'll close. I think we will. I think she'll go ahead and close it, but I think some of the pieces that are working in her favor are the ones that are also working in George Logan's favor, and here's why. So even on the Wheelhouse, when he and Jahana Hayes were here a few weeks ago, I think the way that they separated themselves, George Logan had this way of talking about himself as a local Republican, a Connecticut Republican, and he created a brand for Connecticut Republicans that I think might actually work here for Connecticut Republicans. That I understand the national politics, I understand the national landscape, but I'm going to do. And, from his perspective, he's saying, I'm going to do what I feel is right for women here in our state. And I'm going to do what's right for women in a way that doesn't contradict with the Connecticut Constitution. That means right now, protecting women's reproductive rights is what he says. I think that women, however, have a distrust of the Republican Party because of things like listening to the Supreme Court candidates when they were testifying, interviewing for the job, saying, no, we're going to protect Roe. We're going to protect Roe. And as soon as they had a chance to do so, they did not. So it's sort of interesting because I think that a narrow lead is still a lead and a win is a win either way. But I think it will be a referendum on the Democratic Party if that lead isn't as big as the investment in her race wanted it to be. I want to expand on this conversation. I want to talk about investment. I want to talk about what makes this a juicy race.
Joining us now from New York City, a surprise guest, Leah Wright-Rigueur, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, and author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. Leah, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Always a pleasure to be with you guys.
And you're working on another book as well, too?
Yeah, I am. I'm actually working on a book called Black Collar Criminals that's about scandal and corruption during the 1980s through the present day in the White House.
And where do we find it when it comes out?
It is not. When it comes out, it'll be everywhere, but it's not out yet.
All right,
Still
I'll be looking for that. Hey, you got to hear Mercy talk a little bit about maybe this being a referendum on the Democratic Party if this district. And for folks that don't know, of course, you have lived in Connecticut, so you're familiar with Connecticut. Just help us understand how this potentially could be a referendum on the Democratic Party if something were to happen to Jahana Hayes.
So I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. The first is that the American public, but in particular the American public that has really underscored the Democratic Party within Connecticut, has been expressing its frustration for the last couple of years. And they've been expressing their frustration on any number of issues. But the number one issue that they have been articulating has been the economy. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because by all measures, the economy is doing better now than it was 4 years ago. And that's partly because we came out of the pandemic, and we can feel it in very specific ways around issues like GDP. We're at the lowest unemployment that we've seen in quite some time, but that's not necessarily translating into the micro. So how are people feeling that on a day-to-day basis? Just a really quick example of this, even though we're seeing that people are finding jobs or there's high levels of employment, there may not be social mobility within that employment. So you might be able to get a job, but you might not be able to move up the job ladder. We also know that rent is sky high. It is astronomical. The cost of food globally is astronomically high, right? Inflation. And so what we see is that people on the ground are pointing to Democrats and saying, well, you guys have been in power. What have you been doing to make it so that I don't have to feel the pain of this complicated and complex economy? So if we do see, I think, somebody like Jahana Hayes, who's incredibly popular, in trouble or even losing her race, the first thing that the Democratic Party is going to have to point to is this disconnect between the actual metrics of the economy, but then also what are people feeling in their day-to-day lives.
This is a giant district, Charles. We're talking about encompassing much of Litchfield County, also New Haven County as well, some of New Haven County, most of the western part of the state. So help me understand what people are going through in this district, as we just had underscored by Leah. Of course, a lot of things happening with the economy. She was talking about inflation. She was talking about groceries. These things are generally going to get pinned, whether we like it or not, on the current administration.
We're seeing also food insecurity. We're seeing also lots of questions around taxes, high taxes, and how that's impacting. We're hearing that from voters or potential voters. But I'm also seeing Jahana Hayes connecting with people in areas that I wouldn't expect her to connect. And I don't know whether it's her background as a teacher and she has an ability to communicate in different ways, but she's been fairly successful. And I had an opportunity to talk to some people who were working on her campaign, and they're really excited about the potential of her winning again because she had made those local connections in areas where Democrats normally would not have any connections with residents.
Jonathan, I mentioned the turnout thing. Is that going to help Jahana Hayes tonight? That was the thought that a lot of political pundits here in Connecticut have had.
Well, and that's what I brought up earlier, right? The midterm versus the presidential turnout. And one thing to also add beyond that is, they call it the Fighting Fifth for a reason. I mean, this is a district where, as you mentioned, it's pretty, spread out geographically, demographically, and politically. And so it was kind of a hodgepodge of really two districts going back to the early 90s before it got changed over. So you're dealing with quite a diverse population and even a larger share of unaffiliated voters in the state.
From a public relations point of view, I think, even the fact that Logan isn't holding a party tonight tells you a lot about what his connections were on the campaign trail. I will say that candidates, regardless of whether you think your the likelihood of you winning is lower than you want it to be, you hold a party because you want to engage with the voters, the volunteers. You want to engage with the campaign folks who tried to get you in office. It is a poor public relations choice to not hold a party. And I think Jahana Hayes, this speaks a little bit to what we what we heard before about the relationships that Jahana was able to make on the campaign trail, regardless of whether she thinks she's going to win or not. There's an opportunity for her to connect, to thank them, and to say, listen, we're not going to stop fighting. We're going to continue going. And that's a missed opportunity for Logan.
Leah, joining us from the Big Apple tonight. Ballot access on the ballot, though, here in Connecticut. Shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to allow each voter to vote by absentee ballot? That's the question that a lot of people got in Connecticut. Essentially, state residents getting no longer needing, an excuse to vote by absentee ballot. Historically, who has been behind the universal absentee ballot, and who might it help?
So by and large, absentee ballots and the expansion of the franchise has been something that has been instrumental to what we would call a classical or liberal democracy. It is something that we think about quite a bit in terms of political science, also kind of historical democracy studies, that kind of thing. The idea here is that you want to expand the franchise, that this is one of the most valuable tools in a larger democratic toolkit that you can have on the ground. And one of the things that we have seen over the course of the last several decades is that within the state of Connecticut, Democrats have pushed very heavily for the expansion of both franchise and registration, but also for access to the ballot. One of the things that we learned in the 2020 presidential election, right? Remember those conditions. We said, how can we allow people access to the vote while also keeping them safe, given that we were in the midst of a global pandemic with thousands of people dying per day? One of the things that Connecticut did was put in place things like widespread absentee ballot options, and they saw it had resounding success. People actively went out. We're seeing the same thing with early voting, right? When we put those measures of democracy that expand the franchise in place, people take advantage of them. And so what we are seeing right now is that this long-term push to expand the franchise, to expand democratic tools, has actually been very successful. So the American people, who benefits from this? The American people do. The residents of Connecticut benefit from this. However, there is a caveat to this. Over the course of the last several years, particularly in this heightened partisan and polarized moment, we see that Democrats also benefit more from things like absentee balloting, expanding the franchise. You may have heard the phrase, when you come out to vote, Democrats win. And so there's certainly an element to it that has a partisan edge. And so one of the things that we have seen over and over again is that Republican partisans have resisted this idea of expanding the franchise because it just by and large does not favor them. I will add one little exception to this. As Republicans nationwide, but also in Connecticut, have realized that there is a real disconnect between absentee balloting, early voting, we've actually begun to see some Republicans take a stance that actually it is good for our party and democracy for us to do and engage in these kinds of things. So I would not be surprised to see that this is the kind of measure that passes with broad bipartisan support, particularly despite the fact that we are in this highly polarized, controversial moment and partisan moment. This is something we can all agree on.
Certainly popular in Connecticut and beyond right now, early in-person voting. I just want to let folks know that you can give us a call. We are taking phone calls in both English and Espanol today, as we do have a bilingual call screener. So give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Mercy, I want you to listen to this next clip I got. Yeah. Thanks to that ballot question we had in the 2022 midterms, we have early in-person voting. Mark Mirko, Deputy Director of Visuals at Connecticut Public, got a chance to talk to one early voter, Daniel DeJesus. He told Mark that because he works a double shift on Tuesdays, wouldn't have been able to vote had it not been for the early voting option. Here's Daniel.
I feel like I have a reason to vote right now. The way this country has been going in the last 3 years. It made me get up out my seat and come and vote.
Early voting made it possible for Daniel to vote for his candidate of choice, former President Donald Trump. Mercy, what are you hearing about this turnout? We know that we've had something like 750,000 people almost in Connecticut that came out for early in-person voting this year.
And considering that the population of Connecticut stands at just over 3 million, right? I mean, that's considerable, right? We're almost at a third of the residents voting early. And I think that one of the things that our country, our state does really well is we are not interested in disenfranchising the vote. We are interested in opening the vote as much as possible. Now, I do think that there's pushback in some places, but I will say that early voting measures have shown that when you make voting access to the ballots easier, people will show out. The other thing that I'll say is, I find it interesting. My nephew was really excited. He was actually
What's your nephew's name?
His name is Quay.
We love you, Quay.
So he was actually at a polling station this morning at 6 a.m. with his parents, and he was interviewed by someone from CT Public.
Oh.
And 7-year-old, really excited. And then I heard him in the background on the phone throughout the day when I was on the phone with my sister, and I was like, "Oh, right," because kids are off from schools today because we close the schools on election day. Here's the problem. It's not a federal holiday. So while the kids are off, the parents are on. So there is this, I want us to get to the point where we have, even if it's just a measure that we've adopted here in the state, let's close, a state holiday, whatever that might look like, because state employees, at the very least, if there is a way that we can make access to the polls even easier, I think we'll have higher turnouts, and I think we'll have better results for people's rights.
Great start to our election night show in Connecticut. Coming up next, we surveyed our listeners, and you responded times 750. What did Connecticut Public and the Wheelhouse listeners care about most in the months leading up to Election Day? Stick around for more check-ins with our reporters in the field, and if you have a question about anything you've heard so far, you want to share your voting experience with us, whatever, join the conversation, 888-720-9677. It's the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. It's election night in Connecticut and beyond. I'm excited. We're unpacking what the outcomes could mean for folks across the country and here at home. Oh, that sounds scary. But before we get back to some expert analysis from our esteemed panel, that's better, let's check in with another Connecticut Public reporter in the field. Hey, it's Everywhere Eddie. Eddie Martinez, focusing on breaking news in Fairfield County for Connecticut Public. He's been all over New Haven County today and Fairfield County. Good evening, Eddie.
Good evening, Frankie. How are you?
I'm doing well. Hey, I'm a little stressed here, but I'm calming down now that I'm talking to you. Where are you at? Are you in Fairfield County?
Right now, I'm about to head out to Greenwich. I'm in our studio in Fairfield University. About to head out.
All right, where are you going?
Going to the election night parties over in Greenwich for both the local GOP and for the Democratic Party.
Tell me a little bit about that race that you're going to be seeing down there. I think this is one of the situations where we could have a flip in at least the Connecticut Senate. There may be two that we've heard about. Obviously, Tony Hwang is one. He's going against Rob Blanchard. But the other one, and this is the party that you'll be going to, is Nick Simmons versus Ryan Fazio, if I could talk tonight.
Yep. Yeah. Both are going up against each other and for control of a seat that Fazio was able to win back in 2022, and both Simmons and the local Republican Party in Greenwich have told me that they both feel pretty good about turnout. And they both said that they've been feeling optimistic.
Who do you expect to see at this party later? Where is this? Is this like a Greenwich Republicans kind of deal?
Yes. They're all the people from not only from Fazio but other state representative races. They should be there as well.
Another race to watch in that district, of course, we have Jim Himes bid for re-election. I just mentioned that you have Rob Blanchard and Tony Hwang. Any other things that you're watching down there? And of course, Sujata Gadkar Wilcox running for the seat in the 22nd. Give me something on one of those races.
Yeah, Sujata Gadkar Wilcox. She won the primary over the summer to take over Marilyn Moore's seat on the Democratic side, and so far, because Bridgeport is a heavily Democratic city, she has a solid chance of winning. But of course, nothing is certain. If she does win, she would be one of the first. I believe the first person of South Asian descent to represent that district.
If I were to ever talk to somebody on the phone and they were on the other line, I'd hope it would be you if I were asking about the Valley. And I know that you've been following Cara Rochelle and her race down there. Can you give me anything happening in the Valley?
Yeah, from so far, I've been paying attention to the race here and there over the last few weeks, and it has been going. She is going up against the current mayor of Ansonia, David Cassetti, who is a Republican. Both Cassetti and Rochelle have been attacking each other over social media over the last few weeks. From everything, including Rochelle's ties to a former West Haven official, to Rochelle accusing Rochelle's campaign accusing the city government of misusing funds, or I'm sorry, not misusing funds, of just not applying for grants to help the city. They've basically just it's basically been a lot of rehashing of a lot of grievances that have popped up between the two groups over the last few years. Rochelle did win against the former did win in 2022 against another GOP opponent, but her lead last time was a little bit less than it was in 2020. But in 2020, but she did win in 2020 with a higher margin, probably because of the turnout from the presidential election, and because this is a presidential election now, she may, if she does win, she may win by a higher margin.
Eddie, so good to hear from you. Everywhere, Eddie. He's like Roy Kent. He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. Thanks for checking in. Good luck out there the rest of the night.
Thank you.
He's following that Ryan Fazio and Nick Simmons race, and he's also following Tony Huang, and he's going against Rob Blanchard. Eddie Martinez, Connecticut Public's general assignment reporter, Fairfield County. Still with us, Leah Wright-Rigor, Mercy Quay, Charles Venator Santiago, and Jonathan Wharton. We're holding space for election analysis, but more importantly, your reactions tonight. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas acerca de la elección, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
Just heard a lot from Eddie about the Senate races in Fairfield, and then about Cara Rochelle's seat in New Haven. I know you're out and about in New Haven. I know you're out and about in Brantford. What are you hearing about down there? Maybe some potential seat flips.
Well, I've been always, like you, intrigued by the Valley. Naugatuck Valley is legendary for its...
I'm from the Valley. I'm from the upper part, all the way up. But yeah, you know what it is.
Right? It's kind of high in the Valley.
Right, I know. Okay, maybe lower Valley. I said to make that distinction. I've heard that before. I have heard that. So
I'm from the Valley, guys. Go ahead.
Good point. Lower Valley is, I like to say, below Waterbury. So yes, you're right. But one thing to keep in mind with Rochelle's district is that was Themis's old district. So this is quite interesting, right? Because the Claritas sisters have been representing the Valley for years, and they have leaned Republican and been Republican for quite a while. So everybody's going to be paying attention to that race. And I got to say, the mayor running for this seat is quite an interesting situation because he's a very popular mayor in Ansonia. And so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of tension on this for turnout and what the results could be for this. And by the way, back to the Fazio race and the Simmons race, that is an amazing race because remember, that district got, redesigned. So, and it was to favor more the Democrat than the Republican. So keep that in mind going that way towards Fairfield County, too.
We're going to slide. I love that you said towards Fairfield County because we're going to slide down Route 8 and such and 95 and get to Fairfield County. And then we're going to go national. Mercy, I recently heard Republicans lament about how the demographics are shifting in Fairfield County.
Yeah.
It's why we're hearing that maybe these seats may be up for grabs. Left-leaning voters with a lot of money now living in Fairfield County. It sounds like some folks are sad about that. What are your thoughts behind that characterization?
I think it's accurate. I think they should be afraid, right? I think so. Here's the thing, right? This all plays into the browning of America and the fear of losing a white majority in our country. But we've been going in this direction for a long time. Demographics don't whiten, they darken, so to speak, right? And so by that, I mean that diversity is going to continue to happen to us. And if we don't create policies that people of color can stand on, then they're going to lean towards the parties that speak for them. And the reality is, what we're seeing, and I'd like to, the twice as rule, people of color always know about the twice as rule. You have to be twice as good to get half as much, right? We've been bred on this rhetoric. The twice as rule has led Black and brown young people to college in droves in ways that have led to careers in tech, careers in industries that mean that they're making a little bit more money than their generations before them. And when you have a higher demographic of Black and brown young people who are interested in politics and they have disposable income, it's a bad equation that doesn't equal to a good X for the Republican Party, who doesn't want to acknowledge that Black and brown people exist or have issues that they want to legislate for.
Jonathan, I want you to jump in a second, but first I want to bring in Leah here because I want to talk about the socioeconomic gap in Fairfield County, among the worst in the country. I think people outside of Connecticut know that too, particularly between Bridgeport and other cities in Fairfield County. So any thoughts on how this will impact the way that folks vote? And even nationally, if there's other cities and towns in America that are in this kind of similar situation that we find Bridgeport and the rest of Fairfield County in, Norwalk and the rest of Fairfield County in as well.
Sure. So it's what we call a rich poor state. So Connecticut is notable and noteworthy because it has one of the poorest countries or cities in the country, right next to several of the wealthiest cities in the country. So I think there are two different ways that we can look at this in terms of turnout. One, which is that you have this kind of burgeoning liberal, wealthy class that is emerging in these traditionally Republican spaces. And that's turning this area relatively blue. But it's also true that the working class and poor voters in these kind of poor areas that tend to be disproportionately Black and brown also tend to trend Democratic or blue. So you now have this interesting, I think, coalition that has been there before, that we've seen nationally on a national scale on a number of different issues. And there are different reasons why these two groups or these two classes vote liberal or vote blue or vote Democratic. With that, I would offer one little caveat. And I think we actually heard it from that commentator, from that call-in a couple of minutes ago, from someone who said, it sounded like, I believe he was a working class voter who was coming out of these things.
Waterbury, Connecticut, yep.
Waterbury, Connecticut. So not Fairfield County, but certainly we do see a new segment and sliver of these Black and brown, poor and working class people who have said, you know what? I want to try something different. Yeah. And so we're seeing that they are registering, certainly they're registering to vote as Democrats, but that they are beginning to cast ballots for Republicans. So not in any sizable number, not in any number that should make us go, oh, this is going to flip, this is going to be a radical realignment, but enough so that if you're a Democrat and you're looking at this kind of loose coalition that has assembled across class and basically liberal issues, you should be concerned. Because the base of that group, these Black and brown working class and poor people that have supported you for several years, are saying and looking at the economy, these socioeconomic issues, and saying, I am deeply frustrated with how Democrats have handled this over the last 3.5, 4 years. It doesn't necessarily reflect what is actually going on, but it reflects how people are feeling in their day-to-day lives. So I would pay very careful attention to that and look at this as the new kind of alliance or allegiance that is also really, really fragile.
Jonathan, just a quick comment on how these things are evolving in Fairfield County, just how the demographics may be shifting and there may be more blue votes in Connecticut's Gold Coast here.
Well, let me do a shout out first to Leah because I'm a big groupie of hers, and we share some interests, obviously, concerns about the Republican Party. I think one thing to keep in mind is that we have a lot of new residents arriving to places like Fairfield County, as you all are offering, younger voters, certainly involved in tech. All these things we're considering. But remember, they're new to Connecticut. Yep. And many of them they might be leaning Democrat at times, but so many of them are unaffiliated voters. And more importantly, are they really aware of all the Connecticut-centric issues? And Fairfield County is quirky because it's such a divided media space. Mercy, you know this better than I do because they're kind of not brought into the loop on Connecticut media. Absolutely. So they're kind of left away and they're more tethered to the New York media. Yeah. So this is another issue in consideration, not just for, certainly campaigns, but certainly for donors, engagement, that kind of thing, to be aware of what is going on in Fairfield County where they might be disconnected. And these are newer residents arriving mostly from New York as a result of the pandemic.
We actually have a caller, which is exciting. Evelyn from West Hartford, live on election night. I want to hear what your comment is. Go ahead. Thank you for calling.
Yes, thank you for having me. Very quickly, I have been traveling to Philadelphia on the weekends to canvass with a terrific effort, a group that uses a methodology called deep canvassing that targeted Black and brown communities inside Philadelphia since March. And we were able to accomplish canvassing upwards of 20,000 people that then we worked on to get out the vote for. And it was very impressive. We saw so much feedback from the community that we knew would be heavily on the Democratic side, although we did see a few Republican-leaning voters in these particular neighborhoods.
Thank you so much for calling us, Evelyn. And I'm now going to pivot to Leah, just because I'm really glad that Evelyn shared that perspective. I want to see if that kind of jives with anything that we just spoke about, Leah, and anything that you just enlightened us with.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we are seeing on this election is actually there are two things, big things that we should point out during the election. One, that the kind of coalitions that I think defined Barack Obama's, and carried Barack Obama to the White House, and also were instrumental in Joe Biden winning in 2020, that those kind of alliances and those kinds of allegiances are still there. And right now, if we end up seeing a Kamala Harris victory, it will be because those alliances, those allegiances, that solidarity that we saw with Barack Obama, that we saw with Joe Biden, that the Kamala Harris campaign and ground game was able to pick up on that. And I have to say that the ground game that we've seen has been extensive. It is, I think the caller mentioned, they've been canvassing, but it's not just canvassing. It's spreading out and it's using new technologies and new techniques in order to target voters who are not just likely voters, but voters who are unlikely voters, first-time voters, non-voters. That is incredibly powerful.
Involving George Bush's daughter in this endeavor, as well as Lynn Cheney, as I understand?
Listen, everybody is coming out right now. I think, when we saw Lynn Cheney and Bernie Sanders on the same side of things, you know that something is seriously going on in this country. But with that said, I do have to add a caveat, which is that we have also seen an uptick in the number of voters of color who, though albeit they're a very, very small minority in percentage, the majority of voters of color are going to overwhelmingly vote for Kamala Harris. We have seen an uptick in the number of voters of color that are willing to experiment with Donald Trump. And there are a lot of reasons for that, probably too many reasons for us to go into during what time we have left. But it is something for us to keep an eye on. And I would argue it's not because of Trump. That these are people who are casting ballots for Trump despite Donald Trump. And it has everything to do with this very fragile and fractious relationship that Black and brown voters have with the Democratic Party. I would pay attention to that tonight, particularly in swing areas.
And some other issues that we're paying attention to, I want to tell you about. Earlier this year, we asked our audience to identify election issues they cared about. Wanted to hear more about from the media, both local and national. 750 people responded to our survey. We collaborated with our amazing investigative team, led by Jim Huddadine, to turn your responses into data we could use to shape our coverage. 5 main takeaways are, of course, the economy, number one, including cost of living. A lot of people talking to us about inflation as well. Immigration, mostly rhetoric surrounding it, and the situation at the southern border, which people were upset about. Third most top of mind, democracy. Fourth, respondents asking about politicians offering solutions to climate change. And finally, reproductive rights, particularly in the wake of the overturning of Roe versus Wade and concerns about a national abortion ban. Leah, I just threw 5 things at you. Can you pick out one of those and maybe align it with what voters are thinking?
So I think one is the economy, but I think we've talked a lot about the economy. So I'm actually going to skip that one. The one that I think is really powerful is, well, there are 2 that I think are really powerful. The first one is the concern with democracy. The fact that voters have ranked that as, I believe, number 3 should be a warning shot to anyone who supports the Republican candidate right now or supports candidates that support Donald Trump. Because if people are deeply concerned about democracy, that is the message that initially Joe Biden was pushing and that now Kamala Harris has been pushing. So it means that something is translating and that people are deeply concerned about that. But the other thing, reproductive choice, reproductive rights, the fallout from the Dobbs decision in 2022. What is really quite incredible is that since 2022, support for reproductive choice, reproductive rights, and for abortion has actually skyrocketed amongst the American public, including, and this is not just an issue that is related to women, but including amongst men. Almost nearly 70% of the population believes in reproductive choice and abortion rights within some parameter, right? Within the first, under the old parameters of Roe v. Wade. What that tells us is that the Republican Party has a significant issue on this thing. They passed and put into law and overturned something that is deeply unpopular, but put into effect something that is the majority of Americans are opposed to. And so I would be really, I will be really watching to see how Americans respond and how Connecticut residents respond to these issues, because they have ranked it very high on their issue of things that they care about going into this election. It tells us that reproductive choice, abortion rights, women's health, and gender rights actually matter and are on the ballot this year.
Like with our election survey, we asked attendees of the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Hartford in September what was on their minds as Election Day approached. What a loaded question I asked them there. I went to the parade with a friend of mine, Martha Castillo. She's an associate social media editor at Connecticut Public. She put together the following. We've been doing like surveys, so we've been asking a lot of people the kind of issues that they care about when they vote. We've heard a lot of different responses, but I just kind of want to ask you that general question. What kind of things do you think about?
Definitely healthcare. I think we need to provide more healthcare benefits to people that are coming into this country, as well as our Hispanic community. Invest in their community.
Las ayudas para los niños con condiciones bien difíciles. Que breguen más con los padres con hijos con condiciones y que nos ayuden con los niños.
I definitely say housing. Housing's a big thing. I feel like rent is very high. It definitely needs to come down. If not coming down, at least stay the same.
I mean, I would definitely say that what's motivating me to go vote is the anti-abortion, or if they're pro-abortion, because I believe that women should have the right to decide what they're going to do with their body.
One of them is inequities in healthcare. They are tremendous. The other one is education. You know, I think personally, the greatest investment you can give anybody is a good education.
My biggest thing is funding schools. I want to keep money in the schools because all this crime and everything that's going on, because these kids don't have anything to do. You give them after-school programs, you give them stuff they can do and work towards their future. That's what we need.
I think one of the biggest things right now is housing. Rents are super high, homelessness is high, people can't afford to live anywhere decent.
Housing, and I think more for our younger generation who is trying to establish life, and the economy is so expensive these days, so it's hard for our youth, our 18 to 25-year-olds to go out there and try to buy a house or try to get an apartment, because the apartments and the housing is so expensive.
I want to see someone in political office that's a public servant that is really looking out for the well-being of me, my family, my community. And those are the people that motivate me to get to the polls to make sure that they're there representing me.
Charles, housing came up a lot, a lack of adequate health care as well. What did you hear in that piece?
So we ran a survey last week of Puerto Ricans and Latinos in the state, and it validated everything that was said there. However, it's higher among Democrats than Republicans. So among Republican, Puerto Rican, and Latino Republicans, immigration and food insecurity are top issues. But among everybody else, the economy, housing, education, healthcare are important issues. One of the key problems with healthcare and other issues is lack of translators or interpreters. So it's not that there's not enough healthcare issues, that they're not receiving appropriate access to healthcare throughout the state because they can't communicate in many instances. But we're also seeing an increase of Puerto Rican and Latino men voting or saying they're going to vote for Trump, even though they don't agree with his policy, but they feel that the Democratic Party has not responded to their needs in the state. And we're seeing that across the board, not just with voters, but with legislators who are saying the same thing.
I can't wait to drill down into that even further with you in the coming weeks. So stick tuned to that as one of our regulars, Charles Venator Santiago, will continue to join us on the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Just before we go to break, I wanted to tell you about an interview coming up on the Wheelhouse soon. It's a discussion on how gun policy impacts survivors of gun violence. We're going to be joined by Francine Wheeler. She's the mother of first grader Ben Wheeler. Ben was killed in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. She's going to talk to us in advance of a November 15th event benefiting a charity created in her son's memory called Ben's Lighthouse. If you want to learn more about the event, we'll link it to our website. Tonight is election night. We're back with more Wheelhouse after a quick break. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano from Connecticut Public Radio. Just a few minutes left before the polls close in Connecticut and some other important states as well. Special edition of the Wheelhouse. Still with us, author and associate professor Leah Wright-Ragur, associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. Mercy Quay, CEO and founder of the Narrative Project. UConn professor Charles Venator Santiago. And Jonathan Wharton, professor at Southern Connecticut State University. Hey, guys, throw something at me here today. If somebody's really anxious, what can they do? They breathe? What should we do? Anybody got a tip?
Have a beer.
Jonathan says have a beer. Sign me up. What do you think, Charles?
Take a deep breath, a nice shower, and relax.
I think it's important to remember that this is only one day, and the sun will come out tomorrow. Regardless of where our politics go tonight, or if we find out tomorrow or later this week, the work continues either way.
My daughter's name is Annie, so I like that.
Nice.
Leah, give us something positive that we can do before we talk about some positive things on the way out. What's something we could do to kind of chill here? I like your shirt. It says voting is hot.
Yes, Voting is Hot from Vote.org, the nonpartisan pro-democracy organization that helps us expand the franchise so that everyone has the right to vote and can exercise their right to vote. So what can you do? You can start by turning off the news. There is nothing that you can get from watching television right now because we are not going to know anything, certainly not tonight. And we may not know anything tomorrow either. So as much as I want to say, I'm going to be on television for the rest of the night. I'm actually going to be on until 9 a.m. As much as I want to say tune in. Yes. As much as I want to say tune in, I'm also going to tell people tune out. Go have a drink, have a nice dinner, enjoy the really amazing weather. Connecticut is beautiful right now. And take it all in because this is not the way to spend your night, being anxious and stressing what we cannot control. You've done your part. You've cast your vote. Now it's time to relax. We'll figure it all out tomorrow, or at least by the end of the week.
Let me give you guys 10 to 15 seconds for a final thought. Leah, finish us up on your part.
So my final thought is actually going to contradict the thought I just gave, which is that we all have a role to play in the upholding of our democracy. Your vote is just one of many tools that you have that help our republic, that help our nation continue to move around. The things that we think of as democratic norms, the things that we think of as democracy, aren't just there. We shouldn't just take them for granted. They are upheld by individuals and by people, not by institutions. So if you truly believe in democracy, if you truly want to see a better place for our country and for your children, for your nieces, nephews, and friends, then get in, do the work, and do a job.
Charles,
that's all you can do.
This is the time to think between the difference between the political and politics. the political institutions are going to keep going, but politics is a fugitive thing, and we just need to keep pushing in the right direction.
Jonathan.
I want to pay attention to the exit polls, particularly the turnout. And generationally, that'll be very important this time around.
It's funny. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. I like that. Go ahead.
Susan B. Anthony once said, I will cut off this right arm of mine before I allow the black woman a chance to vote. And it would be ironic if our first female president was a black woman. And I think that's something to celebrate.
A lot of pride for Mercy Quay. We enjoyed her tonight in her suffragette white. And of course, Jonathan Wharton, Charles Venator Santiago, and Leah Wright Rigor. Thank you so much. What a great panel. That's it for tonight's show. We're going to be back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That's right. More space for you to talk. We'll be right back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., recapping local elections and more. Listen on Connecticut Public Radio or watch the show, youtube.com/Connecticut Public. Thank you so much to our producer, Chloe Wynn, Robin Doyen-Aiken, Dylan Reyes, Meg Dalton, and so many more. Thank you so much for the great night on the Wheelhouse. Have a good night, and we'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock.